So by now, we all know the story of Sony getting into the console market with their iconic system, the PlayStation, and they had an iconic controller to go along with it, one that we all recognize today, but also look at and say, you know, that's kind of archaic. There was no joysticks on it or anything there, and it's a very light, simplistic controller overall. But they did work on this throughout the generation, of course, that being the introduction of the DualShock controller. This brought in the two joysticks that we all know now, and then it also had the rumble motors on each handle. But there was a controller that released that slotted in perfectly between these two, and it's one that most people didn't own, let alone ever heard of, and that was Sony's dual analog controller. And today I want to talk about the dual analog controller, what made it a bit different, and why a lot of people just forgot about it. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure you like it and subscribe if you're new. Going back to the 90s, we did have the Nintendo 64 releasing in Japan the summer of 96, with the PlayStation already bursting onto the scene. And the biggest thing that set them apart was that joystick on the Nintendo 64 controller that, yeah, the whole thing looked weird, but in use, it was pretty cool to have that joystick paired with something like Mario 64. Clearly, Sony noticed this as just a few months later at the PlayStation Expo, they showed off their dual analog controller for the first time. And in fact, we have a quote here from Next Generation magazine where they say, most exciting on the hardware front was Sony's new dual joystick analog pad. Displayed under glass, it features two analog sticks, which also function as buttons. An NG representative was one of only a few attendees allowed to test it, and it feels great. The pad also has solenoid-driven feedback mechanism, isn't nearly as sophisticated as the technology behind Immersion's force feedback stick, but it should add a nice kick to many types of games. Now, the interesting thing about this comes down to the release dates for a lot of this stuff. This came out a few months later in April of 97 in Japan. Then it came out a few months after that in the US. However, around the time this released in the US and Europe, the DualShock controller came out in Japan, and then it followed up into the US. So it's not surprising that this would have kind of gotten overlooked, because when it went outside of Japan, they removed the rumble motors. It's very strange that they would do that, and there's still not really a consensus as to why. There's speculation that it could have had to do with patents in general that were pending or were unsure outside of Japan, and they just decided to forego it completely, and that they got all that resolved and then did another release for the DualShock controller. So this was only around for maybe a year, if that, before moving on to the well-known DualShock controller. This is a pretty similar design though, if you look at it. I mean, obviously the difference here with the joysticks is they are concaved, right? So a good spot for your thumbs to sit, whereas if we take a look at the DualShock controller, it's more of a dome shape essentially. And I mean, these are rubberized here on top so they don't slip off, but I will admit, this is a nice feeling here for your thumbs to sit in. The only problem is this is just plastic, so your thumbs do slip around on it as opposed to the rubberized top here. You can also notice the handles are a bit longer and mimic the original PlayStation controller, to the DualShock being a bit smaller on the handles and a bit heavier. I will admit the longer handle would seem like a better experience when it comes to holding the controller, but I think the DualShock just has just the right amount of handle there to hold onto and use, whereas this almost feels like it kind of gets in the way after a certain point. I do think one of the biggest introductions for this controller that gets overlooked a bit does have to do with the joysticks, but not necessarily the sticks themselves. The buttons that they brought in with L3 and R3, those have become pivotal now, and this was the first time they really had used that, and it started to make its way into different games on the PlayStation that you just needed joysticks to use. But the idea of being able to then add two additional buttons to your controller without actually having to add additional buttons to the face or anything, it was a pretty clever idea. I also noticed that R2 and L2 have almost like this little lip that sort of sticks out here, and yeah, they made the buttons larger here as well, just to make it a bit easier to press, and it definitely helps. And obviously the added button itself being larger is much better than that original controller. Now, there was one interesting, unique feature that this had over the DualShock controller, pretty much any other controller at that time, and that has to do with the ability to emulate a flight stick from Sony. See, the way this would work is you have your analog button in the middle, right? So you press that, you can go to digital, and it'll essentially disable the sticks, and you'll just use the D-pad. You can press this, it'll then go into the analog mode, and you can press it again, and it goes into a flight stick mode where it will emulate that Sony PlayStation flight stick that they were also selling for roughly twice the price of this controller. And an interesting idea, but I guess they looked at this and said, hey, there's 2 analog sticks. That would actually line up with what we have with our flight stick. And it worked with a couple of different games. You could think of the usual suspects like an Ace Combat or a Mech Warrior style game. Apparently also like Colony Wars, and there were still over 20 other games that function with this analog feature. And I'm not really sure why that feature didn't make its way into the DualShock controller, considering like the physical makeup is the same. You feel like that would probably be something that would be a bit easier to move over, but who knows? Maybe they looked at the data and they said, no one's really using it in that way, so there's no real point in continuing to do that. I removed the screws. I wanted to pop this open real quick. This is the SCPH 1150 controller, so I believe it is the one out of Japan. This one does have the rumble motor in here, and yes, they only have one rumble motor. They just left this side completely empty, which is weird because while it feels lighter than obviously the DualShock controller, which only has one, it also feels a bit unbalanced because of this. Now, with the US and the Europe version, they leave these pads in here, so you can still solder a rumble motor in, and it should just work. I believe they also even have sort of the cutout here, so as long as you can fit it in, you should be good to go. I feel like most games should recognize it. The analog sticks also on their own board there. Because the analog sticks are so easy to get to, I could technically just recap it with like the domed rubberized sticks if I really wanted to, but the idea of this controller in the first place and getting one now is mostly for collector's value. There's no reason to get this controller over a DualShock as it is. Although I guess you could get it for the flight stick functionality, but at this point, I guess you'd probably just get the flight stick. And ladies and gentlemen, that's gonna do it here for the dual analog controller from Sony. Certainly an odd release considering it was out for, well, less than a year, but it was one that became very important to Sony going forward, introducing concepts like the 2 analog sticks, but also the clickable sticks that became very integral to basically all releases going forward. L3 and R3, pretty important button presses in games today. It came at a time when Sony noticed that the analog stick was becoming very important and Nintendo was pushing it forward with the N64, so they showed up with a controller that not only caught up, but also innovated further. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below, and if this is the first time you've heard about the dual analog controller. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.